In ancient history, few deaths highlight the harsh twists of fate, like that of Mithridates VI, the Poison King of Pontus. Picture this: a man who devoted decades to building immunity against every known poison, preparing for the very method of assassination that took his father's life. But in the end, he found himself ensnared by his own careful preparations. When death became his only escape, it was the year 63 before Christ, and in a citadel overlooking the Black Sea, one of Rome's greatest enemies faced a demise more twisted than any torture could ever be. What makes Mithridates' death truly frightening isn't just the physical pain he endured, it's the mental agony of a man betrayed by his own brilliance. This was a king who turned his body into a living experiment. He aimed for something like immortality, only to discover that living forever could turn into a nightmare when life becomes unbearable. The very immunity he had built over the years turned against him, ensnaring him in a desperate fight between wanting to die and his body's refusal to let go. Mithridates VI showcases one of history's most chilling stories of unintended consequences. His obsession with avoiding death through poison resistancia practice, now known as Mithridates, began from a genuine fear and careful planning. Yet, that same obsession stripped him of the dignity to choose his own end. In his last moments, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by his children, Mithridates learned a harsh lesson. Sometimes, the real horror isn't death itself, but the torment of being unable to die, when that's the only mercy left. To grasp the full tragedy, let's go back to the courts of ancient Pontus, where poison flowed like wine. There, a young prince realized that survival meant embracing the very substances that could destroy him. This isn't just a tale of political loss or military blunders. It's the story of a man who literally poisoned himself to stay alive, only to find he had created his own unbreakable prison. The king, who feared poison more than anything else, encountered a delayed death caused by the very toxins he had mastered. The ancient world had its fair share of brutal deaths and cruel tortures, but Mithridates VI's end stands out for its unique psychological horror. Here, the suffering emerged not from external threats or imaginative cruelty, but from within. Mithridates VI's story is a chilling reminder of how choices can trap you. Every time he took poison to stay alive, he edged closer to losing the peaceful way out that he sought. The man who became immune to poison found himself stuck by it, and this twist would become crucial in ways he never expected. Today, it's tough for many to grasp the deep paranoia that pushed Mithridates to such extremes. But in the ruthless world of ancient politics, his fears were spot on. Royal courts were full of whispered plots and unexpected deaths, where a king's survival often relied on his ability to spot and outsmart those around him. Mithridates opted for a scientific route, turning his body into a fortress against assassination. But fortresses can easily turn into prisons when circumstances shift. The tale of Mithridates VI's death raises unsettling questions about control, survival, and the cost of security. In our modern world, where we take vast precautions against every possible threat, it's disturbing to think of a man who prepared so thoroughly for danger that he ended up trapped by it. His death symbolizes the ultimate failure of human planning, not because his efforts were in vain, but because they were too effective. In the 1st century before Christ, the Kingdom of Pontus was a place where political survival meant constant alertness and clever tactics. Located on the sunny shores of the Black Sea, in what is now northern Turkey, Pontus stood at the crossroads of East and West. It inherited the political tricks from Persian courts and the military ambitions of Greek kingdoms. Rulers lived and died based on their skill at navigating perilous political waters, where weakness invited a swift and brutal death. Into this volatile world came Mithridates VI, a prince destined to turn paranoia into a science and survival into an art. Growing up, the political stage around him was dominated by the looming threat of Roman power. For centuries, Rome had been methodically dismantling the kingdoms that emerged after Alexander the Great. By the time Mithridates matured, it was obvious that merely getting along with Roman authority wasn't enough to survive. The traditional Hellenistic kingdoms were crumbling one after another, and their rulers either fell or adapted, co-opted as client kings or wiped out completely. Young rulers aiming for more than just survival faced a tough choice: bow down to Rome or gear up for war. Mithridates chose war, but he knew that fighting wasn't the only battle he had to fight. The assassination of Mithridates V in 120 before Christ hit hard, showing that even kings weren't safe from the closest betrayal. Poison was the weapon of choice, quiet, untraceable, and perfect for the dangerous world of court politics. That murder unfolded at a banquet among friends and family, turning a simple meal into a deadly trap. For the young Mithridates VI, his father's death became a pivotal trauma, shaping everything about how he saw power. He vowed never to be vulnerable to that kind of deceit again. The royal court of Pontus was like a snapshot of the risks any ambitious ruler faced back then. Succession was rarely smooth. Family loyalty often took a backseat to political needs, and alliances could change overnight. Mithridates' own mother, Leodis VI, had initially backed his younger brother for the throne, forcing Mithridates to run into the wild to escape her plots. This harsh lesson of betrayal in his own family only deepened what he'd learned from his father's murder. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Survival demanded constant vigilance against betrayal from all sides. Mithridates' fixation on building immunity to poison stemmed from both Persian and Greek traditions in pharmacology. Royal courts back in the day were hotbeds of medical research, often driven by rulers facing relentless assassination attempts. Persian kings, in particular, were known for their sharp grasp of poisons and antidotes, regarding toxicology as a crucial royal science. Mithridates tapped into centuries of knowledge when he set out on his ambitious quest for self-immunization, taking these practices further than anyone before him. The social and economic resources of Pontus empowered him to pursue this groundbreaking path to poison immunity, backed by the wealth from their lucrative trade. Mithridates had access to important trade routes and rich natural resources, including a variety of exotic plants and substances for his experiments. More importantly, Pontus was home to diverse groups of people, each with their own knowledge of herbs and folk medicine. Mithridates made it a point to gather all this information, blending Greek scientific methods, Persian royal traditions, and local wisdom to build an extraordinary program focused on studying poisons. His approach to poison immunity mirrored the thinking of his time, when the lines between medicine, magic, and science were often blurred. Ambitious leaders saw knowledge as a means to gain power. Mithridates treated his body like a kingdom, one that needed defending through careful planning and scientific methods. His daily routine involved taking antidotes and gradually exposing himself to increasing doses of various poisons. This was his way of turning his body into a tool for governance and survival. Each day began with a methodical ritual, almost like a religious practice. In the private chambers of his palace, surrounded only by his trusted advisors and the Scythian shamans, known as the Agari, he would drink a specially crafted blend of herbs, minerals, and organic compounds, aimed at boosting his resistance to toxins. This was no ordinary folk remedy. It was a complex pharmaceutical concoction honed over years of experiments. Each ingredient was chosen for its unique properties, and the amounts were adjusted through careful observation of their effects on both willing participants and condemned prisoners. Mithridates' collection of antidotes was among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Historical records state that his universal antidote had more than 50 different ingredients, from common herbs like rue and anise, to rare substances like pontic honey, various venoms, and even powdered precious stones. The mixture was ground into a fine powder, combined with honey, and shaped into small tablets that he took daily. But that was just the beginning. He also regularly consumed small amounts of other substances. Mithridates used a clever method to build up his resistance to poisons. He gradually increased the doses he took, all while testing how his body would react. To do this, he kept a supply of prisoners, people sentenced to death, who became unwilling participants in his experiments. He'd first try out new poisons on them to see what happened, and to find safe levels. Those who survived could be tested further, while those who didn't gave him crucial information about how deadly a substance could be. This chilling approach showed just how ruthless ancient rulers could be and highlighted the lack of ethical standards in medicine back then. Mithridates' daily poison intake had both subtle and profound effects on his body. He adapted to toxins that would have easily killed others, improving his liver function and changing how his body processed chemicals. People talked about him having a remarkable vitality and strength, but whether that came from his poison experiments or just good genes is still up for debate. What we do know is that his body dealt with a lot of chemical stress, which would have changed how he looked and acted. The mental side of his poison immunity efforts might have been even more significant. He had to show incredible self-discipline, consuming dangerous substances each day in a ritual that bordered on self-destruction, all in the name of survival. Every morning, he faced the reality of death, deliberately taking risks with his health. This created a complicated relationship with dying. Instead of fearing it, he learned to control it, preparing him for what was to come in his final hours. But Mithridates was not just looking out for himself. His ability to resist poison gave him a formidable image, one that served him well politically. His enemies would think twice about trying to kill him with poison, knowing their efforts would likely be in vain. Allies would marvel at his seeming immunity to harm, believing it showed divine support or unmatched wisdom. This king's ability to resist poison became a part of his image, boosting his reputation for cleverness and thorough planning. It also sent a clear message to enemies. Typical assassination methods were pointless. Mithridates' experiments would leave a lasting mark, influencing future generations. Ancient doctors like Galen studied his techniques, trying to recreate his famous antidote, giving rise to remedies called Mithridatium that lasted for centuries. The idea of building immunity through controlled exposure, which we now call Mithratism, shaped medical thinking for years. Even today, it impacts how we approach toxicology and immunology, though modern experts have insights that the ancient king lacked. Details about Mithridates' final days come mainly from ancient historians like Aeon, Cassius Dio, and Plutarch, who relied on accounts from that time and Roman records. While they don't always agree on everything, they paint a pretty clear picture of what happened leading up to the king's death. According to Aeon's detailed account, Mithridates was pushed into the citadel of Pantikapaon, today's Kerch in Crimea, due to a rebellion led by his own son, Pharnaces II. This son teamed up with Roman forces and local nobles who were fed up with the king's desperate military plans. The discontent had been simmering for months as Mithridates' preparations for a final push against Rome became more extreme, and his demands on the locals grew heavier. Realizing his father's battle was futile, Pharnaces secretly negotiated with Pompey's representatives, believing that making peace with Rome would better secure the dynasty's future. When Pharnaces openly revolted, many of Mithridates' remaining supporters, including Roman exiles who formed the bulk of his army, abandoned him. The speed of this betrayal left the king with only a few loyal guards and his two youngest daughters in the secluded citadel. In his last days, Mithridates was consumed by rage and deep disappointment. Plutarch tells us that the king couldn't sit still, pacing back and forth, unable to sleep. He raged against his people's ungratefulness and his own son's betrayal. This was a man who once led powerful armies and commanded trade across the Black Sea, but now he found himself desperate, plotting insane escapes and considering extreme actions. His health had taken a nosedive. He looked frail and aged, his strength drained by years of stress and the toll of his poison immunity. When Mithridates learned that Pompey's forces were closing in, he realized there was no way out. Cassius Dio recounts how he understood that capture would mean being paraded through Rome in chains of humiliation he thought worse than death. This wasn't a rash decision made in a moment of despair. It was a calculated choice by a man who always wanted to steer his own fate. Ironically, the defenses he built up to protect himself now became obstacles to his escape. He started preparing for suicide, first making sure his daughters wouldn't suffer the shame of Roman captivity. Both young women, reportedly named Mithridates and Nyssa, had been promised to foreign kings and were valuable political assets. According to Aeon, they even asked to drink the poison first, knowing their fate would likely be forced marriages or worse. The king's choice to grant their wish showed his love for them and his belief that death was better than the degradation waiting for them as captives. The poison Mithridates chose for this final act was hidden in the hilt of his sword. It was a deadly mix he had kept ready for just this purpose. Like the daily antidotes he took, this substance was designed to quickly and surely end life, overpowering the body's defenses with its intensity. He carried this final solution with him for years, always prepared for this moment. There might come a time when Mithridates' immunity to regular poisons would need a different plan. The fact that he had a backup suggests that, despite his confidence, he sensed some limits to his immunity strategy. The scene, as told by ancient historians, is chillingly intimate, more horrifying than any public execution. Here was a man who had spent his life shielding himself and his family from poison, now forcing the same toxic substance upon his daughters and himself, trying to escape something even worse. The trust his daughters had in him was evident. They asked for the poison first and drank it without a second thought. This moment showed their strong, loving bond, even in such a desperate time. But soon, that trust would turn out to be painfully misplaced. Mithridates found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. When he realized his suicide attempt had failed, it became one of the most heart-wrenching moments in ancient literature. According to Aeon's detailed account, he watched in horror as his daughters quickly succumbed to the poison, while he felt only mild nausea. The substance that killed his children in minutes barely had any effect on him, just like the countless doses he'd taken during his immunity training. For a man who had prepared for this very situation for decades, the failure of his last escape plan must have been unimaginably devastating. In a panic, he tried to speed up the poison's effect by moving around. Cassius Dio recorded that Mithridates began pacing rapidly, hoping that it would get the toxin to his vital organs faster. When that didn't work, he resorted to jumping and running, desperate to make his body process the poison more efficiently. The image of this once mighty king, frantically exercising in his final moments surrounded by his daughters' bodies, captures a uniquely modern kind of horror, technology and preparation failing when they're needed the most. As time went on, and the poison still had little effect, Mithridates began to realize the gravity of his situation. Mithridates was in a terrible spot. The very immunity he had built up to survive countless assassination attempts was now keeping him from choosing how he wanted to die. Every dose of antidote he had taken, every small exposure to poison that had kept him alive, was now working against him when he desperately wanted to end his life. The king who had made himself immune to poison had also trapped himself with it, a fact that turned out to be crucial. The psychological agony he faced in those hours was immense. He wasn't just staring death in the face, he was confronting the total failure of everything he had worked for. The careful methods he once took pride in, that had protected him, had now turned into his prison. Even worse, this wasn't because of enemies or a stronger force. It was the cold reality of his choices over the years. Every smart decision he made to stay safe had led him to this moment of utter powerlessness. The man who believed he could control everything now found a situation he hadn't accounted for. When it became clear that the poison wouldn't do the trick, Mithridates tried to take his own life with his sword, but once again, his own preparations let him down. According to Cassius Dio, age, stress, and whatever toxins were left in his system had robbed him of the strength to inflict a fatal blow. His hand trembled as he tried to stab himself, but when that didn't work, he simply didn't have the energy for a second attempt. The king, once known for his physical might, now couldn't even manage this last act of control. Then soldiers showed up, sent after his rebellious son, marking the end of his reign. They found Mithridates alive, but clearly trying to kill himself. Now, they faced a dilemma: Roman tradition said great foes deserved respect, yet it was unsettling to watch the famous Poison King struggle in his botched attempt to end it all. It was at this moment that Mithridates made his last request, asking his loyal bodyguard Mithridates to finish the job for him. The fact that he needed to ask for help to die was perhaps the deepest humiliation of all. For a man who had lived to be independent, when Mithridates finally faced death, it turned out to be a letdown. The real drama happened long before, in the hours of mental anguish leading up to it. In a moment of loyalty or pity, one of his men quickly stabbed him in the heart, but that final act was laced with cruel irony. Mithridates didn't die by his own hand, or the poison he had carried for years. Instead, he required the help of a subordinate to end it, something he never expected. Despite preparing for every possible way to die for decades, he had to rely on someone else for what he thought he could always do alone. The aftermath of his death revealed a mix of emotions, even among his foes. Pompey, upon hearing about the king's end, felt a mix of relief and an odd respect for his longtime rival. He realized that he'd been robbed of the chance to personally defeat one of Rome's toughest enemies. However, he also saw that Mithridates' failed suicide attempt had a deeper meaning, one that might actually benefit Rome more than a formal execution. The image of the great Poison King brought down by his own plans would echo throughout the ancient world, showing how futile it was to resist Roman might. How Pompey treated Mithridates' body after death showed the complicated feelings Romans had towards worthy foes. Instead of subjecting his corpse to the usual disgrace reserved for defeated rebels, Pompey ordered a royal burial in the tombs of Sinope, honoring him alongside his ancestors. This choice reflected both smart politics, showing kindness to possibly rebellious subjects, and a true acknowledgement of Mithridates' status as an opponent. The man who feared his body would be disrespected in death ended up receiving the honor of a royal pontic burial. But the impact of Mithridates' death was far-reaching. It signaled the end of serious Hellenistic resistance to Rome's expansion in the East, closing a chapter that had started with the conquests of Alexander the Great centuries before. The kingdoms that once stood against Rome's growing power were now either absorbed or subdued. Mithridates represented the last real chance for an independent Eastern power to stand up to Rome's might. His death sent a clear message to other rulers. Getting along with Rome was no longer a choice, it was a matter of survival. The psychological impact of his demise was huge, more than the immediate political fallout. The story of his failed suicide spread quickly across the ancient world, carried by merchants, soldiers, and diplomats who understood its deeper meaning. It served as a warning about the risks of over-preparation and the unpredictability of fate. This was a man who seemed to have thought of everything, only to be undone by his own meticulousness. It became a story that resonated with anyone who ever thought their careful plans might backfire. Mithridates' death also left a lasting mark on how people viewed poison immunity for centuries. Ancient doctors, studying his case, started to grasp some of its limits. Sure, controlled exposure to toxins could build protection against specific ones, but those same adaptations could also prevent any therapeutic use of those toxins when needed. This realization would help later medical practitioners, although the full picture wouldn't come to light until modern pharmacology and toxicology were developed. As time passed, the memory of Mithridates' death changed, with different storytellers highlighting various aspects depending on the political and social climate. Roman historians like to focus on his defeat, showcasing the triumph of Roman virtue over Eastern cleverness. Meanwhile, Greek writers leaned into the tragic side, seeing his end as a reflection of the decline of Hellenistic civilization. Later, during the medieval and Renaissance periods, authors became captivated by the scientific elements of his poison immunity program, viewing him as an early example of a learned ruler who melded political power with scholarly inquiry. The philosophical implications of Mithridates' death sparked conversations long after the political world around it had shifted. Mithridates' story, once forgotten, raises important questions about knowledge and power, and the unexpected results of careful planning. His life was dedicated to survival, Yet in the end, that very mastery became a trap, locking him into habits that no longer fit when circumstances shifted. After he died, his personal tragedy quickly took on a bigger meaning in history. Roman and Greek writers recognized the power of his story. Pompey, for one, saw how useful it could be for propaganda. He made sure tales of Mithridates' failed suicide circulated across the empire. This image of Rome's enemy, defeated by his own cleverness, reinforced the idea that Roman military tactics were better than the complicated methods of Eastern rulers. Still, even Roman accounts couldn't hide the tragic dignity of Mithridates' death. Many observers, despite their loyalties, felt compassion for his suffering. Interestingly, his death had a big impact on medicine in the ancient world. While it showed the flaws in his immunity approach, it also ignited a renewed interest in toxicology and antidotes among doctors across the Mediterranean. They began to try and recreate his famous universal antidote, leading to the development of preparations called Mithridates. These would become standard treatments for poisoning all the way into the medieval period. They often contained many ingredients and were marketed as offering broad protection, despite few doctors really understanding how they worked or the potential risks involved. Mithridates' end influenced future political leaders for a long time. Rulers throughout history studied his example, drawing different lessons. Some viewed his tale as a warning against over-preparation and paranoia, while others had different takeaways. It's crucial to have several ways to escape rather than just one. Take the Roman Emperor Nero, for example. When he faced his forced suicide centuries later, he worried about running into similar problems, so he made plans for different ways out. Fast forward to more recent years, and political leaders have mentioned Mithridates when talking about the tug-of-war between security and personal freedom. Mithridates' death left a lasting mark, inspiring stories around the world for centuries. In 1673, playwright Jean Racine turned the historical events into a tragedy about love, betrayal, and how power can warp us. While he strayed from the facts a bit, Mozart, with his early opera Mithridates, Re di Ponto, used the tale to dive into themes of family loyalty and political duty. Different artists have highlighted various parts of this story. Some zero in on politics, others on personal sadness, and still others on the ironic twists of fate that make it so captivating. As science progressed, attitudes towards Mithridates' legacy changed too. Back in medieval times, doctors believed the stories literally, thinking he had immunity to all poisons and trying to replicate his methods. By the Renaissance, writers started questioning those claims, knowing that total immunity to every toxin was likely unrealistic given how different poisons act. Today's toxicologists realize that while you can build up specific immunities through controlled exposure, the all-around protection that ancient sources attributed to Mithridates was probably blown out of proportion. The psychological and philosophical echoes of Mithridates' death haven't faded. They've sparked conversation among scholars for ages. His story often pops up in talks about reason versus emotion, the limits of our plans, and how our attempts to control fate can sometimes backfire. Renaissance humanists saw his demise as a perfect example of how a tragic hero can be undone by their own strengths. Mithridates VI is a classic example of how intelligence and foresight can lead to a person's downfall. Enlightenment thinkers saw his story as a way to dive into scientific methods and the unplanned fallout from tech advancements. Throughout history, his military career and death shaped strategies in warfare for ages. Different experts focused on different lessons from his life. Some military theorists admired how he used toxicology to safeguard himself, viewing it as an early instance of science solving military issues. Others critiqued him for being overly fixated on his personal safety, which they argue cost him the loyalty of his subjects and family. Today's strategists see similarities between Mithridates' choices and modern debates over security and operational effectiveness. His story challenges us to face tough truths about preparation, safety, and the unintended consequences of trying to control dangers in our world, a world filled with both protective and destructive technologies. The king who sought to be immune to poison symbolizes how our safety strategies can sometimes make us more vulnerable, trapping us in systems we designed that fail to adapt when conditions change. Mithridates' last hours highlight a powerful aspect of being human under immense pressure. Here was a man who spent his whole life trying to shield himself from a specific death, only to find that his protective measures had turned into his prison. The very scientific methods that brought him success became the cause of his suffering. This shift from strength to weakness, and from careful planning to a stumbling block, brings to light fears about how reliable our plans really are, and how our biggest successes might one day work against us. The importance of Mithridates' death goes beyond just politics. Mithridates the Sixth's tale raises big questions about power, knowledge, and how individuals fit into the larger story of history. His life marks the end of a time when individual rulers believed they could take on powerful states through their own skills and clever ideas. The era of the heroic king, like Alexander the Great and Hannibal, was fading away. Now, success leaned more on strong institutions and teamwork, rather than just personal brilliance. Mithridates' story isn't easy to label. It makes us think about sympathy and judgment when we look at historical figures. His methods were often cruel, using condemned criminals for poison tests and ordering the death of thousands of Roman citizens. Yet, the way he suffered in the end generates real emotion. A man who caused so much pain faced a kind of emotional torture that feels almost like cosmic justice in action. This moral complexity makes his story more intriguing and unsettling than simple tales of good overcoming evil. Mithridates' scientific impact still echoes today, especially in studies about immunity, adaptation, and the unforeseen effects of medical treatments. Modern researchers in drug resistance and vaccine development often refer to his work when tackling the tricky links between exposure, adaptation, and how effective treatments can be. His story reminds us that biological systems are often more tangled than they seem. Sometimes, actions meant to protect can lead to new vulnerabilities, which only show up in the toughest situations. The cultural legacy of Mithridates' death remains strong, inspiring fresh interpretations and uses in many fields. Political scientists analyze his experiences to explore how personal safety ties into political strength. Psychologists note his story to discuss the dangers of over-preparing and being too controlling. Business strategists look at his case as a lesson in how competitive edges can shift. When market conditions change quickly, we can find ourselves at a disadvantage. The real terror of Mithridates' death isn't just about any external pain or suffering. It's about realizing that our strongest defenses can turn into the source of our greatest pain. In these times, we're faced with challenges we've never seen before, and his story is both a warning and a source of inspiration. It warns us about the dangers of over-preparation, yet it encourages us to think outside the box about how we relate to protection and vulnerability, strength and weakness. We need to ask ourselves, is true security about building stronger defenses, or is it about being flexible enough to adapt when those defenses fail? Mithridates, known as the Poison King, found himself trapped in his final moments by the very immunity that had kept him safe for years. This reminds us that sometimes wisdom isn't just about being ready for anything, it's about knowing when to let go of our plans if they no longer work. In death, Mithridates achieved a kind of immortality he never wanted, not as the victorious king he dreamed of being, but as a lasting symbol of the strange irony that happens when human intelligence meets our limitations in the most personal way.